Berlin. Spring of 1945. In makeshift basements, groups of Nazi officers hurriedly burned documents. Lists of prisoners, signed orders, photographs that were never meant to see the light of day. Among them, dozens of women. SS auxiliaries, camp guards, high-ranking secretaries, nurses who cared for the leaders, communications operators, women who for years had been essential cogs in the regime's machinery. Now they try to disappear. They tear off insignias, rip their uniforms, hide their past as if they could bury it beneath the rubble. In the streets, fear is absolute. Rumors about what happens when the Red Army takes a city spread from mouth to mouth. For many of these women, defeat does not only mean the end of Hitler, it means revenge, punishment, or something even more uncertain. Some choose silence. Others try to flee among starving crowds searching for food amid the ruins. Others simply remain still, waiting for someone to decide their fate. The Third Reich falls, and with it falls the cloak that for years protected, justified, and concealed the actions of thousands of women who served the darkest regime of the 20th century. When the gunfire stops and the capitulation arrives, a question arises that no one is prepared to answer. What will happen to them now? Here begins the story that for decades, almost no one wanted to tell. Before the collapse of the Reich arrived, they were already a silent and decisive part of the system. They were young, many barely of age, shaped by years of indoctrination, strict discipline, and the promise of an important role in the new Germany Hitler proclaimed. But their function went far beyond simple assistance. There were the Aufseherinnen, the feared camp guards, women who oversaw prisoners, supervised punishments, and maintained the daily routine in places where suffering was constant. Some gained dark reputations, rising through the ranks because of their severity, loyalty, or coldness. There were also the SS Helferinnen, auxiliaries in communications, logistics, and administration. They handled files, intercepted messages, organized transports, tasks that, from behind a desk, could determine the fate of thousands. Sometimes without questioning it, sometimes with enthusiasm. The Blitzmetal, young radio and signal operators, carried out technical duties, but always under the spirit of serving the Führer. Their youth and efficiency turned them into propaganda symbols, but behind the staged smiles lay an essential role in military coordination. The regime's nurses, trained in institutions aligned with Nazi ideology, cared for officers, commanders, and key personnel. Some took part in programs that mixed medicine and politics, with devastating consequences for those who fell into their hands. And there were the secretaries, women who worked side by side with figures from the Gestapo, the Ministry of the Interior, and the SS. They knew orders, heard forbidden conversations, and typed decisions that could change the course of entire lives. Why did they join? There is no single answer. Some sought social advancement, escape from poverty, or an adventure beyond their hometowns. Others believed deeply in Nazi ideology, convinced they belonged to something great. Many were swept along by social pressure, propaganda, and the feeling that serving the Reich was an almost natural obligation. The truth is that these women were not mere spectators. They formed part of a machine built on obedience, control, and power. And understanding who they were and why they joined the regime is the only way to understand what came after the end: their capture, their trials, or their escape into anonymity. The fall of the Third Reich was not an orderly ending. It was a brutal collapse, directionless, where every street, every basement, every train station became a maze of fear. For Nazi female officers and collaborators, the days that followed capitulation were not a transition. They were a free-fall. When the Red Army crossed the eastern borders and took the first cities, panic spread like wildfire. The women who had served in camps, in barracks, or in SS offices knew that the Soviet advance carried with it a bitter trail of reprisals, abuses, and vengeance. Many had heard stories that traveled faster than the soldiers themselves, accounts of looting, mistreatment, public humiliation, and a hatred accumulated over years of occupation and atrocities. At the edges of forests, in abandoned villages, some officers tore off their insignias and buried their uniforms with their bare hands. Others burned them along with documents and photographs that could implicate them. Civilian clothing became an improvised, though fragile, shield. Amid the destruction, no one could fully hide what they had been. Many tried to blend into the masses of refugees fleeing westward. Entire families walked for days without food, protecting exhausted children as they navigated roads filled with corpses, destroyed vehicles, and farms reduced to ashes. Among them, former officers walked in silence, eyes to the ground, hoping not to be recognized by liberated prisoners who were beginning to appear along roads and highways. But several were not so lucky. Some were identified by former camp inmates, skeletal men and women who pointed them out with a mixture of rage and justice. These improvised captures were quick and sometimes violent. There were cases in which the crowd unleashed years of suffering upon women who had exercised power from behind barbed wire. No uniforms were needed. A familiar look, a voice, a whispered name was enough. In towns and cities, the Soviets organized massive raids. Female officers were pulled from basements, from houses where they tried to hide, from barns where they slept among damp straw and cold. Some were publicly humiliated, handcuffed, displayed before civilians who shouted insults, beaten or shoved as they were forced to walk through destroyed streets. For many, these moments were a brutal reversal of the power roles they had held during the war years. The treatment was not the same across the front. In territories controlled by the Red Army, capture was accompanied by an atmosphere of fury and chaos that exceeded the limits of military discipline. The collective trauma of millions of Soviet deaths, razed cities, and families destroyed was projected onto some of these women with a violence they had never imagined they would suffer. In the West, the British and Americans applied more structured procedures. Once captured, the women were taken to interrogation centers, where specialized officers received them with methodical coldness. They were asked questions with surgical precision: names, ranks, tasks, superiors, dates. Every detail was recorded, personal files were drafted, and their statements were compared with reports, witnesses, and documents recovered from the Reich's ruined offices. For many, the first shock was not the interrogation, it was the silence. Bare cells, coarse blankets, endless hours without knowing what fate awaited them. Some spent the night crying. Others remained in a state of absolute shock. Others held on to the same military rigidity they had learned years earlier, as if discipline could save them. But the deepest fear, the one they all shared, came from the same question that repeated itself in their minds. What did people know about what they had done? The chaos of liberation, the hunger, the public humiliation, the reprisals, and the rigorous interrogations were only the beginning. They did not know whether days of confinement awaited them, months of trial, or whether the past they tried to hide would return to condemn them. In that moment, in the middle of a continent in ruins, none of them could have imagined that their fate after capture would be so uneven, so unpredictable, and for many, so devastating. For many of those women, capture was only the prelude. The real impact began when the cell doors opened, and they heard a word they did not expect to hear so soon: trial. The Allies began organizing tribunals in different occupation zones, and suddenly, those women who had spent days fearing improvised reprisals discovered something even more intimidating. They were about to face a justice that was cold, documented, and public. They were taken to rooms filled with translators, officers, lawyers, and witnesses. Some entered trembling. Others maintained a rigid, almost defiant posture. But all of them shared the same inevitable moment, sitting at a table and listening to the list of charges that, until then, had existed only as rumors behind bars. The trials of Hamburg, Auschwitz, and Ravensbrück became the most notorious. They brought to light names that would become symbols of female brutality within the Nazi regime. Irma Grese, barely a young woman not yet 30, listened as prosecutors recounted her conduct in the concentration camps. Arbitrary punishments, abuses of power, decisions that had sealed the fate of prisoners who never forgot her face. Her presence in the courtroom was striking in its coldness. Her gaze remained steady even as she heard devastating testimonies. Dorothea Benz, a guard trainer, faced accusations describing years of violent discipline and orders that shaped lives. She was one of the women who rose within the system thanks to her extreme severity that now became evidence. Herta Bothe, known for her physical strength, listened to testimonies recounting scenes of cruelty in which she had actively participated. Elisabeth Volkenrath, a camp supervisor, was accused of decisions involving life and death, and her impassive face became an image widely circulated by the post-war press. The accused reacted in very different ways. Some cried inconsolably. Others swore they had had no choice. More than one claimed to have acted out of discipline, attempting to turn obedience into a defense. And there were those who maintained an unsettling calm, as if they didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, the weight of what they were accused of. The charges were severe: participation in murders, systematic mistreatment, torture, oversight of forced labor, direct collaboration in executions. The judges listened unhurriedly. Every date, every name, every document was examined with relentless rigor. But the detail that most shocked public opinion was not the harshness of the charges. It was the discovery that out of the thousands of women who had served in the camps and SS structures, only a tiny fraction ever reached the courtroom. The rest escaped any judicial process, whether due to lack of evidence, lack of interest, or the political turbulence that marked the early years of Reconstruction. Sentences ranged from execution by hanging to life imprisonment. However, many received surprisingly short sentences. Some were released before serving even half their time due to shifting political priorities, lack of prison staff, or administrative decisions that would become deeply controversial decades later. Inside the prisons where they awaited sentencing, reactions varied. Some fell into crisis as they understood, for the first time, the magnitude of their responsibility. Others maintained a hardened resentment, convinced they had been betrayed by a regime that no longer existed to defend them. For the witnesses, survivors who took the stand with trembling hands and broken voices, those trials were not merely a judicial process. They were an act of memory, an opportunity to point to those who, in uniform and with authority, had been part of the suffering that marked their lives. And so, in courtrooms that smelled of paper, sweat, and tobacco, the fate of a few was sealed, while thousands remained silent, invisible to justice. The world was beginning to close a wound, but what was to come would show that punishment did not reach all, not even most. Because while some faced justice before cameras and tribunals, others, far from the spotlight, were already planning their disappearance. While some women faced the courts, others discovered an uncomfortable truth. The chaos at the end of the war offered cracks through which they could disappear. There was no fully organized system. There was no perfect record. There were not enough eyes to watch every border, every convent, every village lost among the mountains. And it was in those cracks that many female Nazi officers found their escape. In the first months of the post-war period, Central Europe was unrecognizable. Destroyed roads, overflowing stations, thousands of refugees moving forward, carrying what little they had managed to save. Among them mingled former camp guards, SS auxiliaries, and high-ranking secretaries. Some walked with their heads covered by scarves, hiding regulation haircuts. Others carried forged documents, handwritten on yellowed paper. The clandestine routes toward Austria, Bavaria, and Italy became corridors of shadows. At the improvised borders, a simple slip could mean capture. But in the general chaos, priorities were not always clear. Many Allied soldiers were more focused on controlling massive waves of displaced people than on meticulously checking each identity. And those women knew it. Some found unexpected refuge in monasteries and convents, in those silent walls where prayers mixed with the smell of wax hid women who months earlier had supervised punishments or managed documents that determined people's fates. There, their pasts became suspended, protected behind thick doors and religious habits that asked no questions. In some cases, the nuns had no idea whom they were sheltering. In others, they simply chose to look the other way. Most chose a different path, a new identity, an invented name, an altered date of birth, a distant village where no one knew their history. Some reinvented themselves as nurses, taking advantage of the experience they had gained during the war. Others worked as teachers, shopkeepers, or domestic employees. They lived discreetly, spoke little, avoided drawing attention. Sometimes they married men who never knew their wives had once lived behind barbed wire, not as prisoners, but as guards. There were cases that caused shock decades later. Women who, already elderly, were arrested after more than 30 years of ordinary life. Their neighbors, accustomed to seeing them watering plants or walking to the market, were stunned to learn that they had served in concentration camps or in the repressive offices of the regime. One of the most unsettling aspects of these stories was their apparent normality. Many did not live in hiding under constant tension. They lived new lives with surprising ease. And if justice was not looking for them, they had no intention of returning to their old names. In some regions, the towns themselves acted as silent protectors. It was whispered, "She was in the war." But no one asked questions. The post-war world needed to move on, rebuild, forget. And that forgetfulness, whether voluntary or accidental, became a shield as effective as any forged document. Not all escaped forever. With time, archives were opened, investigations progressed, journalists followed clues. In the 60s and 70s, several former officers were found working in hospitals, factories, or schools. Some admitted their past with resignation. Others denied it until the end, even when faced with irrefutable evidence. But the reality was undeniable. For every woman who was tried, there were many who vanished among broken borders and improvised papers. Many who managed to rebuild their lives without anyone suspecting. Many who died old, surrounded by children and grandchildren who never imagined who that quiet-eyed woman had truly been. While some paid their sentences in Allied prisons, these others walked freely through new streets, under new names, building a future carefully separated from their past. This dark and seldom told chapter shows that in the confusion of the post-war years, justice wasn't only unequal. In many cases, it simply never came. For the women who did not manage to escape, their next destination was clear and unavoidable: the special prisons designated for former Nazis. Silent, austere centers built among recycled barracks, rusted barbed wire, and watchtowers that reminded them, ironically, of the very places where they had once held authority. In Fallingbostel, Recklinghausen, and Staumühle, the Allies organized facilities exclusively for them. Guards, auxiliaries, nurses, and secretaries considered an ideological risk. These were not ordinary prisons. They were places where surveillance aimed not only to punish, but also to dismantle the mental structure that had shaped these women for years. From the first day, newcomers encountered harsh conditions. The barracks were cold, with narrow bunks and rough blankets that offered no comfort. Food shortages affected everyone equally, and many, accustomed to the power they once held, faced for the first time the reality of obeying without questioning. Forced labor was a key part of the routine. Some chopped wood for hours, others cleaned facilities in silence, dragging buckets of icy water across uneven floors. For women who had once issued orders with firmness, the reversal of roles was a humiliation as painful as the physical exhaustion. But the most striking aspect of these prisons was not the material hardship. It was what happened inside, among them. Two opposing worlds formed within the barracks. Some remained fervent believers in Nazi ideology. They walked upright, spoke with an authoritarian tone, scorned any sign of remorse, and viewed the others as traitors or cowards. Others, however, were morally exhausted. They had watched everything they believed in collapse and had begun questioning their role, their decisions, even their own identity. Conflict was inevitable. Whispered insults in the dark, shoves during roll call, improvised speeches in which a prisoner tried to convince the others that the Reich would return, followed by bitter laughter from those who no longer believed in anything, not even themselves. And then there was the so-called political re-education. 1 hour a day in which they were summoned to view material documenting the regime's crimes, photographs, testimonies, records, statements. Many denied what they saw, turned away, murmured that it was all enemy propaganda. Others broke down in silence, unable to face what they had ignored for years. Some, confronted with evidence of actions they themselves had taken part in, fell into deep crises. At times, letters or diaries written by the prisoners revealed moments of extreme emotional tension. Half-confessions, regrets scribbled in clandestine pages, or, at the opposite end, contained rage against a world that no longer fit their vision. Episodes of desperation were also recorded. Women who could not bear the idea of a trial, of social stigma, or of the weight of their own past. Attempts at self-harm emerged as signs of a mental decline that Allied authorities could scarcely control. In these facilities, justice wasn't only physical punishment. It was a brutal psychological confrontation, looking into the mirror and recognizing a story that, for the first time, no one could justify or hide. Time in these prisons could be relentless or surprisingly brief. Some served long sentences, but many others were released within a few years, freed due to political changes, administrative reforms, or the urgent need to relieve overcrowded prisons during Europe's reconstruction. Crossing the gates back into freedom, nothing would ever be the same. Even so, what happened inside those prisons left deep marks, visible or invisible, that shaped the rest of their lives. Because there, amid bars, forced labor, and ideological tensions, former Nazi officers had to confront something for which none of them were prepared. A world that no longer feared them, no longer obeyed them, and did not forgive them either. When the doors of the Allied prisons opened and the first women stepped back into the outside world, the war seemed like a distant memory, but their past did not. For them, a new life was beginning. Yes, but not a free one. It was a life lived in shadow, built on silence, reinvention, and constant fear. During the 1950s, thousands of women who had held positions within the Nazi regime regained their freedom, or in many cases, were simply never investigated again. The world was changing. The Cold War demanded different priorities. West Germany needed labor, and Reconstruction became the central focus. In that context, many former female officers found a second chance, a chance they never would have imagined while behind bars. Reintegration began quietly. Some returned to their hometowns, where many families preferred not to stir up the past. A change of hairstyle, avoiding uncomfortable conversations, and behaving discreetly was often enough for life to continue. For most, no one asked too many questions. People were busy surviving, rebuilding homes, opening new shops, reopening schools. Others, however, knew that returning to their place of origin was too risky. They migrated to large cities, where they could disappear among factories, hospitals, and offices. Many found work as nurses or assistants, using their wartime experience. Some became secretaries, shop clerks, or teachers. Daily life, shopping for groceries, making breakfast, raising children, became the best alibi imaginable. Some married men who never learned the truth. They built their identities on half-truths. I was in the war. I worked at a barracks. I was a typist. Ambiguous phrases that concealed much darker roles. It was a silence practiced with surgical precision. And that silence grew until it became unbearable for some. There were women who spent entire nights awake, convinced someone would knock on the door at any moment. Others lived in constant terror of accidentally encountering a survivor, an investigator, a journalist, or someone who had simply seen their photograph in an archive. But there was also the other side, those who adapted with apparent ease. Women who never showed remorse, who believed they had done their duty, and who saw the post-war years as an injustice they could not quite understand. These often blended into civilian life with surprising naturalness, as if the past were just another chapter of a story unworthy of much reflection. The most moving, and at the same time disturbing, revelations came decades later. Children and grandchildren who grew up with no idea of their mother's or grandmother's past, until one day, through a book, a documentary, or a letter forgotten in a drawer, they discovered the truth. These revelations caused deep family ruptures, tears, denial, arguments that left lasting scars. Entire families fell apart when the truth came to light. In the 1990s and 2000s, some of these women, by then elderly, published memoirs that blended confession, evasion, and justification. It seemed that, at the end of their lives, they needed to tell their story, even if they did not always tell the whole truth. Others, however, died without uttering a single word about it, not to their children, not to a journalist, not even to themselves. What they all shared was the silent burden of a past that sooner or later returned to haunt them. Because civilian life, no matter how peaceful it seemed, did not erase history. It only hid it. And while some women paid with prisons and trials, these others paid with years of fear, lies, silence, or with a disturbing indifference that showed that, for them, the war never truly ended. When the war ended, Germany lay in ruins, but not only its cities. Its collective identity was shattered as well. Houses, roads, factories had to be rebuilt, and above all, an idea of a country had to be rebuilt. Amid this total collapse, the question of individual responsibility began to fade, and in that fog, thousands of women who had served the regime found an unexpected refuge: social oblivion. In the years following the capitulation, German society needed to move forward. Hunger, poverty, and fear of the future weighed more heavily than reviewing, one by one, the files of those who had collaborated with the Nazi regime. The new governments, first under Allied supervision, and later fully immersed in the Cold War, had urgent priorities: reconstruction, stability, the economy. There was no time, no resources, and no political will to pursue every person who had participated in the machinery of terror. And women benefited especially from that context. For decades, a deeply rooted belief predominated: women were victims of the war, not perpetrators. It was a comfortable narrative, It reassured society, and it reassured the women themselves. It portrayed them as innocents, trapped in extreme circumstances, as wives, mothers, assistants without real power. But the reality, as we already know, was far more complex. There were fanatical women, cruel women, women who exercised authority, punishments, and discrimination with absolute conviction. Yet society preferred not to see them that way. In the 1950s and 60s, films, books, and popular culture portrayed German women as survivors who had endured bombings, family losses, hunger, and rape. This perspective, though containing truth, also served as a curtain hiding a more uncomfortable reality: the active role of thousands of them in the Nazi apparatus. For that reason, while some men were singled out, investigated, or tried, many women slipped under the radar. It was easy to assume they had been mere assistants, voiceless secretaries, nurses without decision-making power. Gender functioned as an unintended but extremely effective shield. Furthermore, we must remember that post-war German society was exhausted. Blaming women, the very ones who kept households running, cared for children, and sustained daily life amid the chaos, was seen almost as an attack on the family at a time when the family was the only thing left standing. Thus, year after year, a silence grew that became almost a tradition. Neither in schools, nor in family gatherings, nor in newspapers was the topic discussed. On the rare occasions it surfaced, it did so in half-spoken words. It was an uncomfortable past, one many preferred to bury forever. And that social forgetting had a devastating effect. It allowed thousands of women to lead normal lives without ever confronting the truth about their role in the regime. But history, sooner or later, always finds a way back. And while German society looked forward, archives, testimonies, and investigations waited in silence, ready to reveal what for decades no one wished to face openly. The wall of oblivion would begin to crack over time, and its fissures lead us directly to the next chapter. As the years passed and previously secret archives were opened, an uncomfortable truth began to emerge. Forgotten documents, declassified reports, and late testimonies shed light on a past many had tried to bury. Names, dates, positions, and places that had remained hidden for decades began to surface, reconstructing a network of female responsibilities far broader than previously believed. Recent investigations showed that many of the women who had gone unnoticed in the early trials not only actively participated in the administration of camps and repressive structures, but also made direct decisions that affected the lives and deaths of thousands of people. Some had lied during denazification processes, hiding their true roles or minimizing their involvement in crimes. Personal diaries, letters, and memoirs discovered after their deaths revealed acts that had never been officially documented. Stories of brutality, of decisions that condemned prisoners to forced labor or death, of orders delivered with precision and without remorse, came to light. Even women who had managed to flee and live for decades in complete normalcy were traced thanks to these modern investigations. Late testimonies from survivors completed the picture, accounts identifying former female guards or auxiliaries by name, confirming that the number of women responsible for Nazi crimes was greater than officially recognized. Some historians concluded that certain of the worst criminals died as respected elderly women within society, never having set foot in a courtroom, while entire generations remained unaware of their past. The revelation of this information not only shocked the public, but also forced a rethinking of the post-war narrative. Women were not only victims of the regime, as Germany's Reconstruction culture had long suggested. They were active participants, with power, agency, and in many cases, direct responsibility over the lives and deaths of others. These modern investigations show that historical memory is imperfect, and that, even decades later, truth can emerge to confront what we thought we knew. By uncovering these stories, society is compelled to ask, what does justice mean when impunity stretches across generations? And how should we remember those who vanished from public history without ever facing the consequences of their actions? The past ultimately resurfaces, and with it, the evidence that many of the women who served the Third Reich lived, worked, and died as ordinary citizens, concealing a dark role that is only now beginning to be fully acknowledged.